All right, let's dive into this. Prohibition. It's one of those periods in American history that just fascinates me.
Oh, absolutely. And the book you've given us, Last Call, it really it goes beyond the usual, the flapper dresses and speakeasies.
Right, exactly. It gets into like the nitty-gritty of how America actually went dry, all the political maneuvering, the social movements. It's a wild story.
And the characters, some real larger-than-life personalities in there.
Okay, so one thing that really struck me early on in the book was just how much Americans, early Americans, how much they loved their booze. I always had this picture of early America as this like straight-laced, puritanical place. But this book, it paints a completely different picture.
Yeah, Last Call really, it shatters that myth. It describes this society where alcohol was just completely woven into everyday life. Like farmers would offer hard cider to visitors as a matter of course.
Right, and soldiers would get daily whiskey rations.
Exactly, and even kids.
Kids, really?
Yeah, children were often given alcohol too. It was a completely different world.
Wow, that's amazing.
It really is. The book even quotes a young Abraham Lincoln. He describes seeing, men drinking all the time.
Right, he actually called alcohol the devastator. But at that point, the temperance movement, at least, was all about moderation, not total abstinence.
Right. And this is where the Washingtonian movement comes in.
Okay.
These early temperance advocates, a lot of them were former drunkards themselves. And get this, they would meet in, you ready for this, a Baltimore bar room.
A bar room.
I know, right? They wanted to promote, responsible drinking, not ban alcohol altogether. It's such a stark contrast to the later prohibitionist stance.
So how did that shift happen? How did we go from drink responsibly to no drinking at all?
Well, the book actually points to P.T. Barnum,
No way. P.T. Barnum, like the circus guy.
the one and only master showman, right?
What did he have to do with prohibition?
He understood the power of spectacle, and he used it brilliantly to draw attention to the temperance cause. His plays, things like The Drunkard, they were hugely popular, and they really helped to kind of legitimize the idea of prohibition as a political issue.
Oh, I see. But, reading Last Call, it's clear that not everyone was thrilled about this push for prohibition.
Oh, absolutely not. You had immigrant communities in particular. They pushed back hard.
And understandably so.
Exactly. For many of them, alcohol was a central part of their culture. They saw prohibition as this attack on their way of life.
Okay, so then you have, on the one hand, these immigrant communities clinging to their cultural traditions, and on the other hand, you have these figures like Carrie Nation, the saloon smasher.
Ah, yes, Carrie Nation.
Talk about a force of nature. Her hatchet-wielding raids, they became legendary. But here's something I found fascinating. While Carrie Nation is out there fighting demon rum, beer consumption is actually skyrocketing.
That's right. Leading up to Prohibition, you see this real shift in American drinking habits. People are moving away from hard liquor. They're choosing beer instead.
Interesting. So beer's becoming more popular. And at the same time, you have this whole movement demonizing saloons.
And the book, it does a great job of challenging that stereotypical image of saloons as, just dens of iniquity.
Right.
They were actually much more diverse. Some were grand, elegant places. Some were these, rough and tumble dives. But importantly, they served this vital social function, especially for working class folks, for immigrants.
Right. A place to gather, to socialize.
To find jobs even.
Yeah.
To get a hot meal sometimes. So yes, some were rowdy, some were problematic for sure. But the book, it really encourages us to look beyond those oversimplifications.
So the temperance movement is gaining momentum. The Brewers, they see the writing on the wall.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, they're not just going to sit back and let it happen.
Oh, no, not at all. They fought back hard. And,
Yeah.
Sometimes they use some pretty questionable tactics.
The book gets into that, right?
Oh, yeah. They poured money into political campaigns. They funded research that, that was pretty biased. They even secretly paid off newspaper editors to publish articles against prohibition.
Wow. Like a full-blown propaganda war.
It really was. And on the dry side, leading the charge, you have the Anti-Saloon League with their mastermind, Wayne Wheeler. The book calls him a locomotive in trousers.
I love that description.
He was a brilliant strategist, incredibly hard worker. He knew how to play the political game, build alliances, really apply pressure where it counted. He was instrumental in getting prohibition passed.
Okay, so we've got Wayne Wheeler and the Anti-Saloon League on one side.
Mm-hmm.
and the Brewers fighting back with their propaganda and their money on the other.
Yeah.
But what about the everyday Americans? Who was supporting Prohibition?
That's what I find so fascinating. The book, it reveals this really strange mix of supporters. You have racists, you have progressives, suffragists, populists, nativists, all these groups united behind Prohibition, but for wildly different reasons.
It's like, what? It just doesn't make any sense.
Well, Last Call does a great job of unpacking each group's motivations. Some saw Prohibition as a way to control other groups. Some saw it as moral reform. Some wanted to protect their own economic interests. It's this really complex web of motivations.
And then you have, like, the economic anxieties of the time. The book talks about William Jennings Bryan, the populist leader.
Yeah.
He saw Prohibition as part of this bigger fight against, as he called it, the money power.
Right. Bryan believed the wealthy elite were profiting off the liquor industry and that, it was at the expense of the working class.
And he was a big advocate for the income tax.
Exactly. He saw it as a way to redistribute wealth, to counter the influence of the rich. So, it's really interesting how these economic anxieties got all mixed up in this push for Prohibition.
And then, boom, World War I breaks out.
Uh-huh.
And suddenly the dry movement, they have this golden opportunity.
Oh, yeah. They used it brilliantly. Their argument was basically that grain should be used to feed soldiers, not to make alcohol.
A wartime patriotic appeal.
It worked. They pushed through a bunch of, for the duration, prohibition measures, and that really paved the way for nationwide prohibition.
So finally, 1919. The 18th Amendment is ratified. The manufacture, sale, transportation of alcohol, all banned. But the book points out that the speed with which it passed, it was partly due to a quirk in the system.
You're talking about the malapportionment of state legislatures.
Yes.
Right. So back then, rural areas, which tended to be much more prohibition, they had way more power than their population would suggest.
So even though, public opinion on Prohibition, it was far from unanimous the way the political system worked, it gave the dry forces this huge advantage.
Absolutely. So Prohibition becomes the law of the land. And, well, let's just say things did not go as planned.
Not at all. In fact, you could say they completely backfired. But we'll get into all that chaos in the next part of our deep dive. It's amazing how quickly things unraveled once Prohibition went into effect. It's like they tried to shut down the legal alcohol industry and accidentally created a monster.
It's a classic case of unintended consequences. Last Call really drives that point home. It describes this almost immediate explosion of a massive black market for booze.
Yeah, and we're not just talking about some guys making bathtub gin in their basements, right?
No, not at all. It was bootlegging on an industrial scale. We're talking rum runners in the Caribbean, fleets of ships just outside U.S. waters loaded with liquor. They even had sophisticated tunnels, pipelines to move all this illegal booze.
Wow, it sounds like something out of a movie.
It really does. And the book actually goes into how some of the families who later became, big names in the legal liquor industry, how they actually got their start in this shady world of bootlegging.
Oh, really? Like who?
Well, the Bronfman family is a prime example. They built this Canadian whiskey empire during Prohibition, supplying, a huge amount of the illegal liquor flowing into the U.S.
Wow, that's incredible.
It's a fascinating story, albeit a bit morally ambiguous, but, it wasn't just these big-time smugglers. Remember how we were talking about the rise of beer before Prohibition?
Uh-huh.
Well, the Volstead Act, the law that enforced the 18th Amendment, it had this loophole. It allowed for the production of fruit juices, even if they, fermented and became alcoholic.
Oh, so people could basically make their own booze. Legally.
Pretty much. It was meant to appease rural America, where home brewing was a tradition. But it essentially gave people a legal way to keep drinking. So while the government's busy shutting down saloons, you have people all over the country getting pretty creative in their kitchens, making their own wine and cider.
And then, of course, you have the rise of the speakeasys. These hidden bars, they became like the social hubs of the Prohibition era.
Oh, absolutely. Basements, back rooms, disguised as all sorts of businesses. You needed passwords, secret knocks, the whole 9 yards just to get in.
It sounds kind of fun in a dangerous sort of way.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Dangerous, thrilling. It's no wonder the speakeasy has become this, this romanticized symbol of the Roaring '20s. But Last Call also, it reminds us that drinking during Prohibition, it wasn't all, glamorous parties and flapper dresses. It was actually really dangerous.
Dangerous how?
The liquor, it was completely unregulated. No way to know what you were getting. Could be top shelf stuff smuggled from Europe, or it could be, poorly made bathtub gin, even industrial alcohol that can make you sick or even kill you.
Yikes. So it was a real gamble.
It was. Last Call tells the story of this drink called Jake. It was made with Jamaican ginger extract.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that.
It was marketed as this medicinal tonic, widely available, but it ended up causing permanent nerve damage in thousands of people. Really, really tragic.
That's awful. And then you have, the loopholes, like the medical liquor exemption. The book talks about how some doctors were basically prescribing whiskey like it was going out of style.
Right. They saw it as a way to help their patients cope with, the stresses of living in a dry world. But it created a lot of opportunity for abuse, for profiteering.
Yeah, the book talks about Charles Walgreen, the guy who founded Walgreens. He actually made a fortune selling medicinal whiskey during Prohibition.
Oh, yeah. He even redesigned his stores to hide his liquor stock, in case the fire department showed up during a raid.
Talk about entrepreneurial.
It really is. But, on a more serious note, probably the most well-known and definitely the most devastating consequence of Prohibition was the rise of organized crime.
Right. Prohibition basically created this huge illegal market for alcohol. And gangsters like Al Capone, they were more than happy to step in and take control.
Exactly. And they built these massive criminal empires controlling, the production, the distribution, the sale of all this illegal booze. And they weren't afraid to use violence to protect their turf. Last Call talks about the gang wars in Chicago. They were incredibly bloody, incredibly brutal.
So this attempt to create a more moral, sober society, it actually ends up fueling this wave of lawlessness, violence, corruption.
Exactly. And that's the irony of it all. Prohibition supporters, they had good intentions, but they really underestimated the complexities of human behavior, the power of the black market.
But, even as Prohibition is failing spectacularly, it still takes a while for the tide to really turn. Why is that?
Well, the dry movement, they had built up this powerful political machine. They had allies everywhere, in Congress, in the White House, even in law enforcement. But as the 20s go on, the cracks start to show. The social and economic costs of Prohibition, they're just too high to ignore.
Okay, so we're heading into the final stretch of Prohibition here. The cracks are starting to show. What was it that finally brought this noble experiment to an end?
Well, one of the most interesting things is how women became this really powerful force for repeal. Yeah. I mean, initially, a lot of women, they had supported Prohibition. They saw it as a way to protect their families from the harms of alcohol. But as Prohibition dragged on, they started to change their minds.
I mean, all that lawlessness and violence, that wasn't exactly creating the safe haven they were hoping for.
No, not at all. Last Call talks about women like Pauline Sabin. She founded this group called the Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform.
Okay.
And she and other women, they argued that Prohibition had basically backfired, created more problems than it solved.
Right.
They pointed to the hypocrisy. Politicians who, supported Prohibition publicly but then enjoyed their cocktails in private. They talked about the dangers of unregulated liquor, and they were fed up with the crime, the corruption.
So their message, it really resonated.
Oh, absolutely. Especially with middle-class women. They were bearing the brunt of Prohibition's failures, tired of living in fear, tired of the hypocrisy, and they wanted their voices heard. And as this movement gained momentum, they found some unlikely allies.
Unlikely allies. Who?
Big businesses.
But didn't big businesses initially support Prohibition?
A lot of them did. They thought it would, increase worker productivity, create a more stable environment. But then the Great Depression hit. And suddenly their priorities changed.
The loss of all that liquor tax revenue, that must have really hurt.
Oh, it was huge. And it made the arguments against Prohibition a lot harder to ignore.
Right.
You had figures like Pierre DuPont, the chemical guy. He had started pouring money into the repeal movement.
Okay.
And they formed these groups like the Association Against the Prohibition Amendment. And their lobbying, it was really effective.
So you have women who were initially divided on Prohibition and big business, which had been, Prohibition, now both working to end it. That's a pretty big shift.
It really is. It shows how much public opinion had changed, how the failures of Prohibition had become impossible to ignore. And then, on top of all that, you have the Great Depression. It was kind of the final nail in the coffin.
Oh, yeah.
The country's in this terrible economic crisis. People are suffering. The government needs money. And Prohibition, which was already unpopular, it becomes the symbol of of government overreach, of
It
hardship.
was the wrong policy at the wrong time.
Exactly.
So by that point, it was pretty clear that Prohibition was on its way out.
Oh, yeah. The writing was on the wall. And then in 1932, you have FDR. He campaigns on repealing Prohibition. He wins in a landslide. It was a clear mandate for change.
And so December 1933, the 21st Amendment is ratified. Prohibition is officially over. It's just wild to think that this period that began with such high hopes, this moral conviction, it ends up being this huge failure.
It really is. It's a cautionary tale for sure. But, Last Call, it doesn't just dwell on the negative. It also looks at the legacy of Prohibition.
Correct.
For one thing, alcohol consumption in America, it actually remained pretty low for decades after Prohibition ended. Now, it's hard to say for sure if that was directly because of Prohibition.
Right.
But it definitely had some kind of impact on how Americans viewed alcohol.
So maybe in a weird way, Prohibition did achieve some of its goals.
It's possible, but the book also tells this other story that's a little more cynical. It ends with this anecdote about Sam Bronfman, the Canadian whiskey guy.
Yeah.
So after Prohibition is repealed, he meets with some Treasury officials, and he tells them that they should be thanking him.
Thanking him for bootlegging all that whiskey.
Yeah. His argument was that by making sure Americans had access to high-quality whiskey during Prohibition, he actually kept them from switching to Scotch.
Wow. Okay.
It's pretty bold, right?
Yeah.
But it does make you wonder, did Prohibition actually end up helping the liquor industry in the long run? It's really interesting to think about.
It is. I mean, the whole story of Prohibition, it's just full of these surprises, these contradictions. This deep dive has been amazing. I have to say, Last Call, The Rise and Fall of Prohibition, it's a fantastic book. Anyone who wants to learn more about this crazy period in American history, I highly recommend it. You can find a link to purchase the book through our affiliate link in the episode description.
It really is a great read. Really well-researched, well-written. It gives you a much more nuanced perspective on this topic that, people tend to oversimplify. If you're interested in American history or the unintended consequences of, social engineering or just a good story, really, you should definitely check it out.
So what about you? What stood out to you from our Prohibition deep dive? Anything surprise you? We'd love to hear from you.